Once regarded as the brightest young talent at Manchester United and one of the most promising youngsters in all of European football, Alejandro Garnacho is on the brink of leaving Manchester United. After a series of managers, a series of off-the-field incidents, and Manchester United's worst performance in the league in 50 years, Alejandro Garnacho's career at Manchester United looks to be completely done. So let's have a look at what has happened to the guy that was once seen as the next Cristiano Ronaldo. I think with Alejandro Garnacho, there's almost two stories going on at once. There's the guy that we've seen on the pitch, the amazing potential, the skills, the aggression, the relentless attacking presence that he has brought to Manchester United. And there is the guy off the pitch. There's almost a circus that's followed this young man, that's gone from manager to manager, that has raised its head at difficult and damaging times for Manchester United. And in an era where Ruben Amorim's biggest single job is correcting the culture in the dressing room at Manchester United, it seems as though that is the thing that has undone Alejandro Garnacho. It seems as though this guy that we all hoped would be the next big thing at Manchester United is leaving because of these off-field incidents. But how much of it is his fault? Is he to blame for the environment that he was brought through in at Manchester United? Is it his fault that he'd already played almost 150 games for the club before turning 22? Has he been given the best opportunity for success, or was this always destined to fail? To look at that, we need to go back to the start. We need to look at when he arrived at the club, and it happened during COVID. In October 2020, he signed for Manchester United from Atletico Madrid for £420,000 as a 16-year-old. And it was mad because obviously we can all remember what the world was like at the time. Football had only just come back after that 3-month hiatus while the pandemic was ongoing. The initial talks to sign him were done over Zoom. There weren't even in-person talks. He was also training on his own at home so that he could get up to fitness and up to speed with Manchester United. The whole world was in turmoil. Garnacho made his name during that FA Youth Cup run in 21-22 and made his first team debut during that run in April against Chelsea. He'd been in the first team a few times leading up to it and finally made his debut in that game. But it's the FA Youth Cup final that took him to the next level in terms of adulation, scoring 2 goals and sealing Manchester United's first title in a decade. And from there came his journey into the first team. But straight away, there was a little bit of a hiccup. On that pre-season tour on the 22-23 season, the new manager, Erik ten Hag, had to reprimand Garnacho for turning up late to some meetings during that pre-season tour. It wasn't a big deal. It was something that seemed to be resolved, and United moved on. And from there, he broke into the first team. His first goal coming against Real Sociedad, assisted almost poetically by Cristiano Ronaldo. Not just his idol, but the person that Garnacho had been compared to for so much of his early career in terms of play style. And shortly after that, he scored that famous 93rd minute winner against Fulham in the Premier League, his debut goal in that competition. And funnily enough, it was the first goal scored by a teenager after the 90th minute in a Premier League game since Kiko Makeda for Manchester United against Villa all those years ago. But again, there had been a few more, just small concerns. Bruno Fernandes mentioned about a potential lack of application in training sessions that maybe was hindering his ability and playtime in the first team. There was also a report that Erik ten Hag wasn't happy that Garnacho would often leave training with his laces untied. Just small things that you just brush under the carpet. It doesn't matter. And I still think a lot of that stuff doesn't matter. He's not the only player to do that. But it started to sow the seed around him that this was going to be a tumultuous relationship with Manchester United. In April 2024, Erik ten Hag subbed off Garnacho at half-time during a game against Bournemouth. We then saw the start of this sort of social media thing where Garnacho was liking posts that were critical of Ten Hag's decision, that felt as though he was being publicly difficult, basically, publicly defying the will of the manager at the time. And again, it just started another narrative that on social media, Garnacho was being a little bit difficult. But these clearly can't have been too big a concern because in April 2023, he was offered a new contract, signing that until 2028, the contract that he's still on now. And after that time, he went on to have probably his best form for Manchester United, scoring that Puskas award-winning goal against Everton. That overhead kick's genuinely one of the best goals I've ever seen. One of the cleanest contacts, best finishes I've ever seen from any Manchester United player. And that's when his star was probably at its highest, at its peak. He was seen as one of the best youngsters in the world. He was nominated for the Golden Boy Award. He was someone that looked as though he was actually going to be the guy that we all thought he was going to be. From there, he basically became a mainstay at Man United, probably playing too many games. Erik ten Hag basically played him every game he was fit for, through form, out of form, and back into form again. The FA Cup final was a fantastic moment. He scored a goal and was just part of that feel-good atmosphere with Mainu, with Ahmad, with Højlund that United really needed after what at the time was one of United's worst ever Premier League finishes in 8th place. But it seemed as though he was a shining star in that team. He also made his debut for Argentina at the time. He was included in the Copa America squad. It was all going so well. It seemed as though all that stuff had gone away and that we were able to move forward with him as one of the main players at Manchester United. Things started to change though when Erik ten Hag left the club. And I don't know whether he took with him some of that goodwill, whether he protected or whether he could look after Garnacho in a way that others couldn't, or maybe the totting up process of those small things became too much. Because after that we began to see things just starting to crumble a little bit for Garnacho. One thing that happened that wasn't his fault whatsoever was the interaction with the fan outside of Old Trafford before that game against Paddock, where he was basically told to pass more, to work on his first touch. Just stupid things that you don't need to tell a professional footballer, especially one that at the time was, I believe, 20 years old. You don't need to coach him as a fan as he's on the way in to play for Manchester United. It was a ridiculous moment that should never have happened. We then saw that weekend he score a goal against Leicester while Ruud van Nistelrooy was the interim manager, and he didn't celebrate. Bruno Fernandes came out and said that Garnacho feels as though he has lost faith of some of the supporters. This was during a time where his form wasn't at its best, but it was clear that things weren't quite right. The mixture of fans thinking this should be out, criticising him publicly, the mixture of him not celebrating. We saw this time when Erik ten Hag had left, obviously the club's form wasn't good enough. Garnacho wasn't putting up the goals that he would have wanted. It felt as though things were either going to go one way or another. When Ruben Amorim came in, it kind of went the way that everyone hoped it wouldn't. We saw straight away him and Marcus Rashford were reprimanded and left out of that game against Manchester City, and it seemed to be for something that had taken place in training earlier that week. Now the reports were that there'd been an altercation between Garnacho and Ruben Amorim, and during which Garnacho turned his back on Amorim and refused to speak to him. Obviously we weren't there, we don't know exactly what happened, but what's clear is Ruben Amorim felt it necessary to drop Garnacho and Rashford for that Manchester City game. Rashford never played for United again after that, and Garnacho did. He came back into the squad. So clearly, even though, yes, we're starting to see a pattern of these bits and bobs and problems and disciplinary issues, he was able to turn things around and come back into the team. The problem was, United's performances on the pitch, including Garnacho's, were so bad that it never fully felt like these things went away. Garnacho all season has had a little bit of an air of frustration about him. It's felt like he's been forcing things a little bit too much, trying a little bit too hard. And maybe you can say at least he's trying hard, because some of his teammates, you wouldn't even give them that credit. But it has always felt as though it's been a stretch or an extra touch or just bobbling into the defender or hooking the ball wide. He's missed a few high-profile one-on-ones. It seems as though he hasn't developed the way that people thought he would. How much of that, though, is the team around him, is the situation around him? Everyone at Manchester United, except for basically, I don't know, Bruno Fernandes, Mazraoui, Yoro, maybe De Ligt to a certain extent, and Ahmad, has had a pretty terrible season this year, Garnacho included. Do you blame him individually, or is he unfortunate that he's worth probably 40 or 50 million quid, and if you want to get rid of someone, he's an easy person to get rid of? Talking about dropping Garnacho in that moment, Ruben Amorim said the following quote: "For me, it's important that the performance in training, the performance in games, the way you dress, the way you eat, the way you engage with your teammates, the way you push your teammates. For that, they have to fight for their place in the team, and today, the team, we proved we can leave anyone outside the squad and manage to win if you play together." I'm going to say it again, it was not a disciplinary thing. That quote always felt a bit weird to me, because on one hand you're saying it's the way you dress, the way you eat, engage with your teammates. On the other hand, it's not a disciplinary thing. I don't quite know what Ruben Amorim means there, but it's pretty clear that he's criticising not just the way that Rashford and Garnacho trained, but the way their demeanour, the way they carry themselves, the way their conduct is on and off the pitch wasn't quite right. In February 2025, after the City stuff had blown over, Garnacho had been back in the team. He'd been one of the first names on the team sheet. We then saw the game against Ipswich Town. When he subbed, he didn't go and sit in the dugout with his teammates as you'd expect. He went straight down the touchline, into the dressing room, and didn't return after the game. Afterwards, Ruben Amorim said that he'd wanted to just get changed and change his clothes, but that he had to act in a certain way if you play for Manchester United. And essentially essentially said he owes everyone dinner, or he'll pay for dinner for everyone in response to what he did. So again, it was clearly, on one hand he's saying, he was just doing this, he didn't want to get changed, but on the other hand he's saying he owes everyone dinner, he's going to pay for dinner for everyone. So there's clearly, again, an error, a misstep in how he's conducting himself. And that moves us on to a section that I didn't really want to have in this video, but I do feel as though we can't go through Garnacho's time at Manchester United without mentioning his brother Roberto. Now, this is his younger brother, who I believe is now his agent. That's according to the Daily Mail and other newspapers as well. And this has been an ongoing thing with him. And some of this, I think, was blown out of proportion. Some of this was either potentially not true or certainly amped up for the sake of social media outrage. But there has been a long-standing, what's the word? I don't want to say feud, but certainly disagreement between certain United fans and the way Garnacho's brother has conducted himself online. One of the incidents that people latched onto was this whole Messi unfollowing Garnacho rumour that was just absolutely absurd from start to finish. The report was Messi unfollowed Garnacho because Garnacho praised Ronaldo. Well, apparently, and according to Roberto Garnacho, Messi had never followed Garnacho in the first place. There was no unfollowing, and the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. Again, I actually don't disagree with him on that, and I think it's fair if you want to, defend your brother, defend your client, if he was at that time, with something that is basically dispelling a myth and a lie that had been perpetuated. I don't see a problem with that. But the reason it caught traction at the time was because he was disagreeing with Rio Ferdinand. Obviously a United legend, he had said that Messi had unfollowed Garnacho. And looking back at it, it's a slightly odd thing for Rio Ferdinand to be particularly digging into, and it's not necessarily usually in his wheelhouse who's following who on social media, but that was why that caught a lot of traction at the time. Roberto Garnacho arguing with Rio Ferdinand on social media. Then there was the whole leaking of team lineups thing, and I might be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, as far as I could see, there was never any proof that Roberto Garnacho was the one leaking these lineups for Manchester United. There were a lot of Twitter threads, there were a lot of people debating it, there were a lot of bits of evidence here and there, circumstantial, about when he's in the squad, when he isn't, when the lineups get leaked, when they don't. But it was never revealed, it was never announced, it was never fully said that Roberto Garnacho was the one leaking those lineups. However, it added to the whole circus around him and his family on social media. Every 2 minutes, you had to hear about Garnacho this, his brother that, and it just became an absolute mess. And finally, the straw that broke the camel's back, the Europa League final. United's biggest game, well, potentially single game in a decade. The difference between £100 million of Champions League money, European football next season, the difference between United being able to pay players more, attract better players, and generally be in a much healthier position. United lose to Tottenham. Don't need to go into that. I actually refuse to go into that. Afterwards, we saw Garnacho with another public interview talking about how disappointed he was to not play in that game. And it wasn't just, I'm really gutted, I think I could have helped. It was, I've played in all these games leading up to this, and now I'm left out. What's that all about? And clearly Ruben Amorim agreed. He didn't like what he heard, because as soon as that had happened, literally days later, it was made clear that he won't play for Manchester United again, and he will be sold in the summer. Let me know in the comments, do you think that's too harsh? I know we've come up with this list of all these misdemeanours, and I think you could probably go through loads of former United players and bits that happened off the pitch here and there. You could look at some United greats, and they aren't just a catalogue of golden moments where nothing bad ever happened. Wayne Rooney had his moments, Roy Keane had his moments, Ryan Giggs had more than his moments. People do things off the pitch whilst playing for Manchester United that aren't always perfect, but they don't necessarily just get sold overnight. Or do we think we've seen a player in Alejandro Garnacho that's got a bit too big for his boots, that isn't necessarily living up to the potential that he had, and he represents this unique position where you could probably get 50 or 60 million quid for him, that's pure profit. Only really Kobbie Mainoo and Bruno Fernandes tick that box alongside him. He's probably the most valuable asset we have, and maybe now is the best time to cut our losses. One thing that is for sure though, I think there's a sadness in all this. I don't revel in the fact that we're getting rid of a young player that we thought might be the next best thing at Manchester United. I don't like how he's been handled at times, played too many games in a row, relied on too much for a youngster that wasn't really putting up the numbers, and yet he still had to play. He still had to be the talisman. He still had to go out and win us big games in desperate times. I don't think that's fair, but clearly there are things going on off the pitch that have led to this moment, and if successive managers have had to discipline him, have had issues with his conduct in training, on social media and behind the scenes, maybe we have to just say this hasn't worked out. thank you for your time at Manchester United, but you have to move on. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know your thoughts on Garnacho's time at Manchester United. Are you disappointed the way it's ended, or do you think this has been a long time coming? We'll see in a bit.